Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Dr. David Gioe, who is an associate professor of history at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, where he also serves as history fellow for the Army Cyber Institute. Before starting his academic career, Dave was an intelligence officer with the FBI and CIA. He also retains his commission as a commander in the Navy Reserve and is assigned to the Defense Intelligence Agency's Defense Attaché service. And I'd like to remind listeners that Dr. Gioe's opinions do not represent the United States government's position or the Department of Defense's positions on any of this subject matter. Dr. David Gioe, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Thanks so much for having me.
So you are a historian. Could you talk a little bit about how you approach this kind of subject matter?
Sure, absolutely. I think that what I call being a historian. I'm the only historian in the Army Cyber Institute, and I'm glad that they've decided that they needed a historian. And so what I try to do is I try to help them develop a historical consciousness or a historical disposition to understand that the history of what you might call cyber operations, information operations, psy-war, psyops, political warfare, whatever you want to call it. There's a prehistory to that, and the cyber operations didn't sort of show up with the internet, let's say, and it's important to kind of understand where we've come from. And so, yeah, I think history, the history of strategy, the history of statecraft, intelligence history, which is what I do. I study the formation of intelligence communities, mostly in the West, but also in Russia, and these kinds of history, I think if you apply them, what we might call applied history, really helps us illuminate some of the challenges and the problems, and helps clarify some of the strategic contexts as to where we are right now, revolving cyber operations more broadly defined.
Great. So the conversation that I'd like to have with you today is about Russian active measures and the implications for the free world. Perhaps we could start off by working through which for many may be some confusing terms. So could you talk about what active measures are and how do they differ from some of the other buzzwords that we hear today, fake news, misinformation, disinformation, information warfare? Could you just illuminate that vocabulary space for us a little bit?
Absolutely. The terms are really important, but it's also important not to kind of become slaves to the terms, and
Sure. Yeah.
And so there's long academic articles parsing all this stuff, but in a broad sense, active measures is basically a Soviet and then a Russian term. And active measures are being the change that you want to see in the world. These are conducted by intelligence services, and it's the stuff that gets Hollywood's interest, right? So if you were to sort of have a Western, not perfect but close analog, you might call it covert action, right? And that's how states act in a non or misattributable way in the international system. And so if you think about most intelligence services, they collect intelligence and then they provide analysis on that intelligence. But there's also this other realm of covert action where you might think of sort of the hidden hand of a coup or a poisoning or a so-called black information or covert influence, right, where you don't really know who's the author of it. And so active measures is just sort of this blanket term that involves basically what the Russians do as covert action. And it could be a political assassination. It could also be counterfeiting currency. It could be forging documents. So all of that stuff would be lumped under that term. The other terms that are important to sort of get a handle on early would be misinformation, disinformation, and then what some people have called malinformation. And these are important to note. Disinformation is when an adversary wants to deceive you. There is an intent to deceive. So that's what let's say Russia today might do. They're trying to deceive you. There's misinformation, which is simply, hey, I got it wrong, and I tweeted something that I shouldn't have tweeted because I didn't fact check it, and I wasn't trying to fool anyone. I thought it was right, but it was wrong. So, oops, sorry. Now that's misinformation. And then malinformation is information that's probably true, but is out there in the world unjustly or with an intent to harm someone. So, if you were to hack into my email and find all the terrible things that I've said about my colleagues, and then put that on the internet, under davesayshorriblestuff.com, that might be malinformation. So what I'm mostly concerned with as a matter of statecraft is disinformation. But a lot of the responses at the human level to misinformation and disinformation do overlap.
That was helpful. Thanks. Would it be fair to say that disinformation could be considered a tactical tool, maybe within a larger operational or strategic active measures campaign?
Sure, you can plug it in anywhere. That's the beautiful thing. It can be, disinformation can be used tactically. You could try to, put out the wrong coordinates for a bomb shelter, and people don't make it there in time, just at a very tactical level. Or you could spoof the position of something, and that might become tactical disinformation. And at the strategic level, disinformation sort of rarely exists on its own, right? It's part of something broader. And I think one of the things that we need to understand about disinformation is that usually it runs alongside other operations. So disinformation as part of a larger campaign to fight Georgia, or disinformation as part of a larger campaign to capture Crimea, for instance. So disinformation, often doesn't just sort of fly by itself, but it's usually part and parcel of a larger strategic objective.
Right. So active measures have been a newsworthy item, I would say, over the last couple of years, especially since the Mueller report that reported on the 2016 United States presidential campaign meddling. So active measures tends to be tied to Russia, but are other nation states deploying these same kinds of techniques? And I'm speaking like present day right now, or does it tend to be Russian centric?
Well, it's only Russian centric because for me, because I'm most interested in it, and I think the Russians are the best at it, and we can come back to that. But the Chinese are very active in this space. The Iranians are very active in this space, and in fact, even some Gulf states are very active in this space. And I should also add that I don't study domestic disinformation as much as I study foreign disinformation attempts, because I'm interested in sort of statecraft as opposed to political campaigns and strategy. But the sad fact of the matter is there's an awful lot of domestic disinformation that people put out, that Americans put out, we're here in America, where they know it's wrong, they know it's intended to deceive people, and they do it anyway. So there is a big space to talk about that. And one of the dangerous parts for studying it is that these then amplify each other. So for instance, the Russians will take a piece of domestically generated disinformation, and they'll just amplify it. Or on the other hand, the Russians will seed something into our information ecosystem, and some political entity or party or political figure will then take it and retweet and share it. And so you can't draw a line between foreign disinformation attempts and domestic disinformation attempts, because they operate it's sort of in this, they're intertwined as hedgerows. And this is a huge problem, because we do have, I'm a former intelligence officer, and we have an exquisite intelligence community full of people who are really trying to do the right thing. But how do you deploy your intelligence community against a problem that has, that intersects so often with a domestic component? And so it's really a wicked problem.
Yeah, it most certainly is. So perhaps we could mine some of your historical expertise, Dave, and talk about the history of this kind of these kinds of dark arts being deployed throughout time. Do you think you could give us a few choice examples of what you might consider active measures or the dark arts that might surprise some of our listeners?
Sure, I'll give you an example. I'll give you two Russian examples. Again, there's lots of other ones out there, and getting back, before I do that, let me just get back to something I should have said on your previous question about
sure.
Russia in particular, which is that the Russians have sort of given us a proof of concept at how powerful this is, and that's one reason why other states have become so active. China may actually overtake Russia in putting out disinformation. They're certainly, according to a Soufan Center report, they're certainly on track to do so. But Russia really paved the way, and I think showed us how powerful this can be. Getting back to your this question about some examples, not every bit of disinformation is effective, and in fact, it's awfully hard to figure out if there's any impact at all, right? How do you measure the impact of a covert influence campaign, right? How do you then measure what would have happened had you not intervened? And that's something that the U.S. government has to figure out when we do covert influence, and it's something that the Russians try to figure out. It's very hard to sort of to assess these things and to offer some measures of effectiveness. One, however, that really took on some steam in the 1980s was what's called Operation Denver, but I think is more often known as Operation Infection. And this was the idea that the U.S. government developed the AIDS virus at the Army's Biological Warfare Lab at Fort Detrick, Maryland, and deployed it particularly against people in Africa. And this is 100% fiction. This is disinformation. There is not a kernel of truth to this whatsoever. And yet, if you ask Americans, hey, have you heard about this? Where do you think this is from? A lot of them will actually parrot back without knowing the source. They'll say, oh, I think that the Americans made a mistake, and this virus got loose. So that one was particularly effective. And I think you can even see now, vaccine hesitancy amongst some communities as not trusting the government on medical topics. And I think some of that can, in fact, be traced back to Operation Infection. So a clear win there in the Soviet column. And again, there's a strategic context, right? It's not just messing with America. This particular operational problem that the Soviets were trying to solve was trying to pry non-aligned African countries from the U.S. sphere of influence and try to convince them that actually the Soviet Union was the sort of better choice for partnership in a bipolar world. So they didn't just wake up in the morning and say, how can we screw with America? They had an operational problem in the context of the Cold War in the 1980s that they were trying to solve, and this was a good way to try to drive a wedge between the U.S. And African countries that the U.S. was wooing. So, it's important to kind of put it back into its strategic context. Also, however, there was one that sort of flopped badly, which was in the 1980s. I can't remember where the Olympics was in Los Angeles. Maybe you can chime in and remind me.
I don't remember.
It was, let's call it 80, 84, something like that.
There was one games that was supposed to be in Moscow, but we boycotted it, did we not?
Yeah.
So it wasn't that one.
No, it wasn't. No, this was in Los Angeles, and
Okay.
what the Soviets wanted to do was they wanted to basically exacerbate racial issues in the United States, and so they forged a letter from the KKK, basically threatening African athletes that if they showed up to the American Games, that the KKK would, sort of give them, quote, a warm welcome, unquote. And it was a forgery. It was identified relatively quickly as a forgery. Nobody believed it, and the games were a success. So, just because you swing the bat, in covert influence doesn't mean you're going to hit a home run each time.
Right. So just reinforcing that last point you made there. So what characterizes these things as active measures are that these are deliberate actions promulgated by a nation state, but it's intended to go into the ecosystem without attribution to that nation state and cause some kind of an effect. Is that about right?
Yeah, that's right. And I think, to use another sort of more current example, there was an exercise in 2015, which was called Jade Helm, and I think it was a joint exercise, maybe Army led, and it was basically special operations forces training across several Texas and several southwestern U.S. states, and the Russians started to put out information that this was actually a covert Obama administration effort to take people's guns and to round up political dissidents. And so it was all just done under the cover of an exercise. And of course, this is largely a Russian point of view of the world, because they always thought that NATO was going to, start a war against the Soviet Union under the guise of an exercise. So they were obsessed with exercises as cover. And so when the U.S. decided that we were going to have an exercise, which we always do, that the Russians would say, oh, hey, this is actually. The Russians always feared war with NATO the most. And so they thought, well, what do Americans fear most? They must fear the Obama administration coming in and disarming, everyone. And so, then the right wing got involved, the news outlets got involved, and pretty soon, this got picked up and sort of, was legitimated. And I think even the Russians surprised themselves, that the Americans would buy this stuff. And in my view, that was really the precursor for the 2016 election meddling. The Russians learned in 2015 just how susceptible Americans were to flat out nonsense in the information ecosystem. And so they then decided that they were going to go for broke in 2016 and see what happened.
Right. And to our audience, Dave sent over to me in advance of this discussion a number of different articles, both academic articles and popular articles. And we'll have links to these in the show notes for people to check out. But one of the articles that you sent over, Dave, was called Cyber Operations and Useful Fools, the Approach of Russian Hybrid Intelligence. So do you think you could take the historical discussion that we've been having and start bringing that into the current AI-fueled environment that we find ourselves in, and maybe start talking about some of the implications. Well, let me just lead the question a little bit more. I was struck in this article when I read it that some of the feedback that you collected, the Russian reaction to their early stage social media operations and active measures on social media, that they themselves were frankly surprised about how well it seemed to be working. And on top of that, how cheap it was too. Do you think you could take that in whatever direction you think is productive for this conversation?
Sure, absolutely. I think it gets to one of the problems that the Russians have, which is that they have a conventional asymmetry vis-a-vis NATO, vis-a-vis the US, vis-a-vis the European Union. And so, they can't go tank to tank, sub to sub, missile to missile, aircraft carrier to aircraft carrier, F-35 to F-35. That's just not what they can do. But they want to fight back. From their point of view, they are surrounded and encroached upon, leaving no strategic depth between NATO members and the West. And so what you need to do, if you can't confront NATO or challenge NATO conventionally and symmetrically, is you have to turn to asymmetric or unconventional operations. And so the Russians studied the US, quite effectively. And they actually found some cleavages in our society, and spoke, basically good enough English with good enough, contextual nuance to make really powerful memes that then spread like wildfire over social media. And so they found a couple of different, the best disinformation campaigns go with the grain, right? They go with what people already think. Mm-hmm. And if we were to just sit down and name some of the social cleavages in our society, I think we could come up with a pretty good list. But if you asked me, hey, what are the social media, what are the societal cleavages in Russia, and how do we then craft content, crack those open? That's a pretty challenging task, but the Russians did it pretty effectively, in my view. And so, look, they looked at Second Amendment and gun issues. They looked at the meaning of patriotism. They looked at, veterans versus, draft dodgers. They looked at
vaccine stuff.
Later they looked at vaccine stuff. Mm-hmm. They looked at so many different social cleavages, and then they just got to racial issues, right? And they just got to work hammering away at this stuff, for pennies, Facebook ad spends of not that much money, and then people are like, oh geez, I didn't know that, and then they share it. And so, yeah, I think the Russians were sort of surprised how quickly this stuff spread. And it's not just disinformation, right? I mean, hacking John Podesta's emails, so-called hack and leak or hack and dump, constant wall-to-wall coverage, from RT or Sputnik, so-called news outlets. It's not just, memes, right? It's a whole ecosystem of disinformation and nonsense. And yeah, I'm sad to say that a lot of people bought it. A lot of people shared it. And it wasn't just what people thought. In a couple instances, the Russians actually, from their troll farm, which was in St. Petersburg, Russia, they actually created Facebook events in real life and got opposing sides to show up to places through completely fraudulent Facebook events in order to confront each other. I can give a couple examples of that if you want, but the point is that it was almost like the cover of the original Godfather book by Mario Puzo that had the marionette on there. Yeah. And the the Russians were the puppeteer. And, they gave Americans, red meat for whatever their political, sort of pre-commitments were. And Americans, took the bait.
Right. In this same article, you describe the, the old school methodology of engaging one-on-one with political campaigns, or trying to infiltrate a political campaign or other like local influential groups. And it's like one operative trying to infiltrate these various different organizations. But now you've got Russian trolls or thousands of distant operatives that are infiltrating like small group, Facebook groups, and doing the same thing that the old school operatives would do, except at scale. Would you say that that's fair?
Yeah, it is fair. And, just look at, so take 1984, for instance, where, the Soviets didn't want Ronald Reagan to win re-election to the presidency in 1984. And so the Russians, the Soviets, took out full-page ads in the newspaper that said "Reagan means war!" to try to paint Reagan as this warmonger. And again, they just didn't wake up in the morning and decide to do this. There was a strategic problem they were trying to solve. In this case, it was Reagan's emphasis on building up the Pentagon, Star Wars, right? The Russians, right? Reagan was outspending the Soviets and seemed very aggressive to them, and they just couldn't keep up, right? So again, there's a problem they're trying to solve that's beyond let's just screw with America. But none of this worked. Obviously Ronald Reagan was reelected by a landslide. And so, they're taking out a newspaper, is sort of just, taking a bullet and shooting it into a pond, and, maybe you struck a fish for dinner. It's a very low probability chance, but hey, you don't win the lottery if you don't buy a ticket. So the Russians were always prepared to buy a ticket. But in the case of social media, you don't have to go to the newspaper and set up a front company to run an ad, right? You can't say "Reagan means war!" Brought to you by the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C., right? Or, the Friends of the USSR. But now you can inject so much so quickly into the ecosystem. And again, getting back to RT, the former Russia Today news network, news in quotes, and Sputnik, we let it happen. So yeah, it's hugely alarming, and it almost seems legitimate now, and this kind of gets to broader questions about journalism and whatever, but the fact that everyone sort of thinks that you can watch whatever news channel you want that will sort of appeal to your particular ideology. And so it doesn't seem to bother anyone that RT does it too, except their particular ideology is to advance Russian interests at the expense of U.S. and liberal democratic interests.
Yeah, right. And to our audience, by the way, Dave just mentioned journalism. I would love to have this same kind of a discussion around journalism. So if anybody has any suggestions about a guest who can talk about the nature of journalism historically and bringing that into the present, please let me know. So Dave, what are some implications going forward that you think we may be encountering or that we should be on the lookout for, or any suggestions on how the free world might be able to mitigate some of the risk that we are facing?
Sure. There's a whole world of policy responses, legal responses, communications, Decency Act type stuff. I'm not a lawyer, I don't want to wade there. So let me just sort of put a flagpole for someone else where there's a whole lot of policy responses that could deal with, regulating social media, updating existing laws. I'm not enough of an expert on legal matters to sort of critique policy. So for me, I'm interested in the human dimension. And one of the things that I've long argued was that I don't know that we even want to be totally insulated from disinformation, because critical thinking and sort of healthy skepticism is a muscle, right? And we need to use that muscle. We need to always weigh evidence. And I'm afraid that, let's say, this can't happen, but let's say there was some magical algorithm that could filter out anything on Facebook or Twitter that wasn't 100% true, right? Then you sort of get, fat and happy and lazy, and your skills of critical inquiry would wane. So I'm not even sure that, A, I don't think it's possible, but B, even if it were, I don't think that would be healthy. And what's been interesting to me is that, the tools of the historian, History 101, right? Intro to Historical Inquiry, where you evaluate sources and you evaluate documents. You don't need Mark Zuckerberg to guard you, or the U.S. Congress to guard you and regulate out lies. Throughout history, historians have said, hey, what are some of the things that you need to do to weigh someone's claims, right? You would weigh their sources, you would weigh competing evidence, you would weigh evidence that they left out. And so, to me, being a historian is almost a, is a precondition or a prerequisite to really develop critical resilience against this kind of stuff. And I found a pamphlet that the Swedes put out starting in 1943. The Swedish government put out a pamphlet called "If War Comes," and it was talking about what to do in case of war. And they kept it going throughout the Cold War, right? What do you need to know? How do you deal with radiation? How do you deal with alarms? And then they kept it going. How do you deal with terrorism? And it's a little booklet that would be sent out, like, in the old days, like the phone book was, to your house. And they stopped it after the Cold War, right? Because there's going to be no more war. Why do we need this? And in 2018, they updated it and they put it out again. And so you can go online and Google, Swedish emergency preparedness, and they have a page. It's a short booklet, but you can get a PDF. And it's in a bunch of different languages, actually. And they have a page on emergency preparedness, and then it says, be on the lookout for false information. And if you'll just indulge me for a second, I just want to read what the Swedes say about it. The quote, states and organizations are already using misleading information in order to try and influence our values and how we act. Their aim may be to reduce our resilience and willingness to defend ourselves. It's absolutely true. And so what they say, quote, the best protection against false information and hostile propaganda is to critically appraise the source. And then they give a bunch of bullet points about how you might do that. Is this factual information or opinion? What is the aim of this information? Who has put this out? Is the source trustworthy? Is the information available somewhere else? Is this information new or old? And why is it out at this precise moment, end quote. And so to me, reading that, you might call that media literacy. But as a historian reading that, to me, that's just the historical method, right? That's what I would do with any document that I encounter. And so I think, whether we call it civics or whether we call it media literacy or whether we call it the historical method, there are, to me, this is what cybersecurity at a personal level would look like.
All right. Well, I think that is a fantastic place to leave off. And as I mentioned, we'll have links to all of these resources in the show notes. And with that, Dr. David Gioe, thank you so much for being on the Cognitive Crucible.
Thanks so much for having me.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.